It was a seemingly ordinary day for 31-year-old stay-at-home mom Joan Risch on October 24th, 1961, at her home in Lincoln, Massachusetts. Joan was married and lived with her husband and two children, a son and a daughter, in a nice suburban home in a quiet, safe neighborhood. That morning, Joan's husband, Martin, went out of town on a business trip to New York, and Joan went about her usual day. Unfortunately, that day would turn out to be anything but usual. Sometime in the early afternoon hours, while her young son slept upstairs and her daughter played at a neighbor's, Joan would vanish mysteriously. She would leave behind a house smeared in blood and an array of clues that would puzzle investigators for 60 years. Welcome to Bitter Endings, a true crime podcast. I'm your host, J.R. Erickson. In Bitter Endings, I'll bring you stories of those taken too soon, the silent many who no longer have a voice through which to seek justice. Today's episode of the Bitter Endings podcast is sponsored by my latest novel, Helm House, which is the second novel in the standalone Troubled Spirits series. These are paranormal murder mystery novels inspired by true crimes. And Helm House particularly is inspired by the disappearance of Joan Risch. And though the novel is very much fiction, there is a character in the novel whose storyline originally came to me after I read about Joan's disappearance. If you are interested in Helm House or any of the Troubled Spirits novels or the Northern Michigan Asylum series novels, you can find those books on Amazon.com in ebook, paperback, and in audiobook. Or you can visit my website, www.jrericksonauthor.com. Thank you for listening. Joan's early life was marked by tragedy. She was born Joan Carolyn Bard on May 12, 1930, in Brooklyn, New York. At 9 years old, Joan moved with her parents to an apartment in Mountain Lakes, New Jersey. Joan's new home burned to the ground with both her parents inside on February 23, 1939, when Joan was just 8 years old. Her mother and father both perished in the fire. Family members that Joan did not know well, her uncle and aunt, Frank and Alice Natras of Rochelle, New York, would take her in. And during that time, Joan would take on their last name, becoming Joan Natras. Reports would later emerge that Joan was sexually abused by her adoptive father, Frank, prompting his wife, Alice, to divorce him. Joan attended Wilson College in Pennsylvania, eventually graduating with a Bachelor of Arts degree in English. For a period of time, she worked at the Crowell Collier Publishing Company in New York, a company that published textbooks. She started originally as a secretary and later took on the position of editorial assistant. Joan was pretty, with pale blue eyes and dark brown hair cut to frame her face. She was also an avid reader. Joan met her future husband, Martin Risch, in 1954 at a Harvard football game. One report said that this was a blind date. Martin Risch was a graduate of Colgate University. After his graduation, he entered the Air Force as a second lieutenant, spending part of his tour in Korea. In 1953, Martin enrolled at the Harvard School of Business Administration, graduating with a master's degree in June of 1955. 6 months after his graduation, Martin and Joan got married. Joan eventually left her job at the publishing company for the family life, opting to become a wife and mother, and subsequently she gave birth to her daughter Lillian and later to her son Douglas. In 1961, Martin Risch took a new job with the Fitchburg Paper Company, a choice that would require the family to relocate. Martin, Joan, and their 2 children moved to a suburb on Old Bedford Road in Lincoln, Massachusetts. Their home was quaint, 2 stories, white, on a large lot with trees and bushes to offer a bit of privacy. It was set back from the road. Martin's job included selling special grades of the Fitchburg Paper Company's paper, as well as finding new territories for the company's products, which meant a lot of travel. The areas he covered included all of New England and most of the state of New York. Martin traveled a lot, sometimes being on the road for as long as a week. This left Joan home for long stretches of time with her 2 small children, at times a lonely existence for the housewife. Joan Risch and her family had only lived in the house in Bedford for 7 months when Joan would disappear, and they didn't have a lot of time to make friends, again because Joan was home with 2 small children and Martin was often traveling for work. Women from the local League of Women Voters in the area described Joan as slightly built, quiet, unassuming, but seemingly quite content. Her neighbor, George Robichaud, said he'd met Joan just 3 months before she disappeared, when she'd walked over and introduced herself and her 2 children to he and his wife. He described her as quite reserved but friendly. Other neighbors said that Joan's family was her life. Joan's best friend, Olga Madden, said that Joan loved the outdoors and nature delighted her. She mentioned that Joan rarely drove. She preferred to walk places with her children. She also said that Joan enjoyed gardening, reading, and watching birds. Joan was reserved to the point that it could be difficult to get to know her initially, Olga explained, but after spending time together, they had become close friends. A librarian from the town that Joan and Martin had lived in before they relocated to Lincoln said that Joan loved books and that she visited the library often twice a week to check out books. She also said in the newspaper article that I was reading from that Joan checked out, quote, good books, not the trashy kind, which I thought was quite funny when I read it. In 1961, the neighborhood that the Risches moved into had many households similar to Joan and Martin's. Husbands were gone to New York or some other city for work during the day, and wives were home with their children. This could offer a particular vulnerability in a sense, because anyone familiar with that neighborhood would know that the women were home alone and the husbands were gone. At the time of Joan's disappearance, she was 5 foot 7 inches tall and around 120 pounds. Her husband said that she generally wore skirts and sweaters or blouses. Joan also suffered from asthma and took medication daily to deal with the disorder. So let's move back in time now, 60 years gone by this upcoming October, to the final morning that anyone would definitively see Joan Risch. That morning, Joan's husband went out of town for a business trip. He woke Joan early and said goodbye while she was still laying in bed. Later in the morning, wearing a white blouse, black skirt, and black shoes, Joan took her 4-year-old daughter, Lillian, to the dentist, where Joan had a cavity filled. I'm not sure if Lillian had dental work done that day or not. Joan then went to the grocery store and bought $15.83 worth of groceries. At 11 a.m., Joan returned home for lunch. She put her 2-year-old son Douglas down for a nap upstairs, while her daughter played outside with another little boy from the neighborhood. Around 2 p.m., Joan, wearing a trench coat, mowed her lawn. She then took the neighbor boy as well as her own daughter to the boy's house across the street, and this was the home of her neighbor, Barbara Baker. Joan left the children in the boys' yard and the baker's yard to play on the swing set. She did not let Barbara Baker know that she had brought her son home or that she had left her daughter there as well. Around 4 p.m., Barbara sent Joan's daughter Lillian back across the street to her own home. However, the girl returned a short time later, telling Barbara that her mother wasn't home and the kitchen was covered in red paint. Barbara hurried to Joan's house. As she got closer, she could hear Joan's son Douglas crying. When she stepped into Joan's kitchen, she quickly realized that the red paint Lillian had described was not paint at all. It was blood. She summoned the police. The Massachusetts State Police, as well as police in Lincoln and investigators from Lexington, would descend upon the Risch neighborhood to search Joan's home and to speak to her neighbors. They found the kitchen in disarray, with the phone ripped from the wall and tossed in the trash can. There was blood smeared on the floor and walls. There was a phone book lying open to emergency numbers. Blood led to the second-floor nursery where Joan's 2-year-old son Douglas had been unharmed in his crib. There was also blood in the driveway and on the trunk of Joan's car. Despite what sounds like a large amount of blood, investigators would later say they did not believe there was enough blood at the scene to imply that Joan had suffered a fatal injury. I'll also comment here that I looked at some of the crime scene photos online, and to me, it did look like a lot of blood. I could be wrong, but it definitely appeared like more blood than would come from a superficial wound. I also read in a later news article that State Police Detective George Harnoy estimated that about a pint of Joan's blood was discovered in the house, which again kind of seems like a lot. Some of the blood had been hastily wiped up with a pair of Douglas, Joan's 2-year-old son's, corduroy pants and several paper towels. There were no signs of robbery, and the only disarray in the house included the blood smears and a small table that was tipped over. A bloody thumbprint was found on the wall next to where the phone had been, and this thumbprint would never be matched to anyone that lived in Joan's house or that was in her neighborhood. Eventually, the blood found in the house was matched to Joan's blood type, which was type O. After Joan's disappearance, Martin was contacted in New York. He was in a sales meeting, and he was shocked to hear of his wife's disappearance. He had last seen her that morning when he said goodbye before driving to the Logan airport. He said that he would be home immediately and left his meeting to return to Lincoln. The night Joan vanished, investigators brought a bloodhound to her home. The dog crossed back and forth between the Barker home and Joan's home several times, but he never went down the road or alerted to any other locations around the house, including the woods. Searches went on for days and included police, state conservation officers, and airmen from the Hanscom Air Force Base. They conducted searches of the woods and streams, both on foot and by air. In the days after Joan vanished, her husband held a press conference on his front lawn. He appeared exhausted and stressed. When reporters asked how the public could help, Martin said, quote, "Try and find her." He abruptly ended the press conference and returned to his house, where his father and aunt had joined him to help in the care for the children and the search for Joan. In the days after Joan vanished, police developed a theory that she'd been forcibly abducted from her home. An October 29, 1961 article in the Boston Globe laid out the police's theory of what happened to Joan Risch. They suspected her abductor had already been watching her for several days and knew that her husband was gone during the day and that Joan was home alone with her 2 children. A neighbor of the Risches told police that the day before Joan vanished, she'd heard her garage door open and close, but when she looked out, there was no one there. On the day Joan vanished, she again heard the garage door open and close around 3 p.m., which is also the time when investigators think Joan went missing. The woman who was hearing her garage door open and close was usually at work during the day, but on that Monday and Tuesday happened to be home sick. Investigators believe that Joan's abductor had been watching Joan from the neighbor's garage and that he believed the homeowner, the woman who lived in the house, would generally be gone and he may not have been aware that she was home. After watching Joan, he crept onto Joan's property and hid behind her car, watching as she gardened in her backyard. Police believe Joan came upon him and he attacked her, possibly striking her in the nose, where she then fell upon the back of her car, leaving a drop of blood on the trunk and another smear on the right rear fender. Blood was found in both of these locations. They believe Joan may have screamed, but the trees and foliage around the house prevented neighbors from hearing. Joan then ran into her house through the back door, which led into the kitchen. She tried to call for help, leaving more blood on the telephone number holes as well as on the phone handle, but the man followed her inside and ripped the phone from the wall. Police suspect her attacker then hit her again, and she was knocked to the kitchen floor where she may have lost consciousness. The man then wrapped her in a charcoal-colored top coat, which would turn out to be, I believe, the only thing missing from the house, and carried her through the woods behind the property to Virginia Road, where he may have parked his vehicle, though the police also said it was possible he was parked in the Risch driveway based on a single sighting of a vehicle being parked there that day. So again, initially, police assumed Joan had been abducted, and I read one article which stated that police pretty quickly surmised that Joan had been attacked by a, quote, sex maniac. But then they started to hear some eyewitness statements that didn't quite make sense. Barbara Baker, Joan's neighbor across the street, said that around 2:15 she saw Joan walking up her driveway carrying something red, and that Joan looked dazed. Another neighbor, 14-year-old Ginny Keene, said she noticed an old blue car parked behind Joan's car around 3:30 p.m. when she got home from school. Police also received tips from people driving in and around Lincoln the day Joan vanished. Multiple people reported seeing a woman who resembled Joan walking along Route 128 in Waltham, which was near the Cambridge Reservoir. Other sightings came in closer to Joan's home. 2 separate witnesses claimed they saw a woman that might have been Joan walking Route 2A in a knee-length gray coat with a handkerchief over her head and her head down. One of the witnesses said the woman appeared to have blood on her legs. This was in the vicinity, again, of the Cambridge Reservoir, and divers eventually searched the reservoir, but no trace of Joan was found. Other tips came in after Joan vanished, including a man who owned a motel in Bedford. He said that a woman behaving strangely nervously checked into the motel at 4 p.m. on the day that Joan disappeared. She wrote her name as Patricia Richardson, and she had no luggage or purse. She left the motel an hour later. Joan's husband was asked to look at the writing sample left by the guest, but he was unable to determine if it belonged to his wife. A cab driver in Cambridge told police that he picked up a woman the afternoon Joan vanished and that she matched Joan's description. He said she acted confused and changed her destination multiple times. When she went to pay her fare, she took the cash from a paper bag. All of these tips led people to wonder if Joan had made herself disappear. However, the people who saw her the day she vanished reported that nothing seemed amiss with the young mother. She was cheerful and in good spirits. Police launched an exhaustive search for Joan in an attempt to identify the woman witnesses had seen. Again, they searched the woods surrounding the Risch property. Searchers found girly magazines and a woman's panty girdle in the woods not far from the Risch property, but they were unable to connect these to Joan. Investigators fingerprinted over 5,000 people, hoping to identify the thumbprint near Joan's phone, but they came up empty. They searched a 6-mile radius around Joan's house, searching for the mystery car that the teenager had seen in the driveway that day. They searched neighbors' garages and nearby buildings, but again, they found no evidence of the car. Investigators also questioned all known sex offenders in the area, but they found no promising leads. More oddities came into Joan's case when state chemists said the blood found in Joan's house may not have come from a wound. They sent the blood samples to Harvard Medical School for a deeper examination. Detective Harnois later told the press that the blood was consistent with menstruation, which meant it was possible Joan had suffered a hemorrhage that day, which resulted in her leaving the house in a dazed state. This revelation spurred gossip in the community of a potential miscarriage, or worse, a botched abortion. Later, after chemists at Harvard examined the blood, they stated that they could not say definitively if the blood was in fact menstrual blood or if it came from a wound. Other issues investigators kept coming back to was the attempt to wipe up the blood at the scene. They couldn't understand why a person who entered Joan's house to attack and abduct her would bother trying to clean up the blood. District Attorney Droney said that he'd never investigated a crime where an individual attacked a victim in her home, then carried her away with him. And I did read several quotes by this district attorney, and I had the impression that he was leaning more heavily towards the theory that Joan vanished either of her own free will or that she had an injury and wandered from the house. And in terms of his comment that they'd never investigated a person who attacked someone and then abducted them from the home, I just want to pause and make a quick aside because, again, this is a sleepy Massachusetts town in 1961. And the reality is they didn't have many abductions or murders at all. So to have investigated any that were similar is a lot less likely. But in reality, when we look back in time now, there have been a slew of killers who went into homes and abducted their victims. Ted Bundy, for one, his first ever confirmed victim, he attacked while she slept in her bed in Washington. He then carried her wrapped in a sheet out of her house. Investigators did start at one point looking at a man named Howard Cooper as a possible suspect. Cooper was a fugitive at the time who'd twice been charged with sexual assault with the intent to kill. He'd been institutionalized in a mental hospital for his crimes, but he'd escaped in 1945. A man who matched Cooper's description was working at a restaurant in Lincoln, Massachusetts, and he skipped town right around the time that Joan vanished. I'm not sure if this lead ever went anywhere, but I didn't find any additional articles that mentioned Cooper. Further complicating Joan's case were Lillian Risch's comments about what happened the day her mother went missing. The 4-year-old said that Mommy had sent her to the Barker's house to play because Joan was going out. Lillian also said that there was a strange man in the house when she left, though this may be an admission that came from Lillian later, and it's possible that some of these comments came from things that she was hearing about her mother's disappearance rather than things that she actually witnessed that day. Despite theories circulating about Joan leaving on her own, her husband Martin was adamant that his wife did not disappear of her own accord. He was convinced that someone had abducted her. In an article published in the Honolulu Advertiser, Martin was quoted a month after Joan's disappearance saying, quote, "I'm just living from day to day, trying not to dwell on the possibility that she may be dead. Though the kids are fine, I'm certain they miss their mother very much." More than a year after Joan vanished, another strange twist would arise in her case, and I have conflicting reports about how exactly this twist came about, so I'll offer both. The Standard Speaker, a Pennsylvania newspaper, reported in a February 1963 edition that Serene Gerson, editor of the Fence Viewer, had decided to look into books checked out by the Risch family at the library in the year before Joan went missing. She discovered that Joan had checked out a plethora of books that included stories about odd vanishings and disappearances, including a book called Into Thin Air, about a woman who faked her own disappearance and left behind a kitchen smeared with blood, as well as other things that were similar to Joan's case. The alternative story that I read about how Joan's reading history was discovered was that this same person, Serene Gerson, was investigating a historical missing persons case and noticed when she was checking out novels about disappearances that Joan Risch's name was in several of those books. In any case, the press latched on to Gerson's discovery, and a whole range of new theories popped up, essentially surmising that Joan staged her own death and that she had been either using this reading material as inspiration or the place where she got the original idea to stage her own death, or perhaps to come up with more believable things to do in order to stage her own death. However, those that knew and loved Joan, including her husband, said no way. Joan adored her family, and she would never, ever have abandoned them. In March of 1964, a popular British mystery author offered his own theory on what happened to Joan Risch. Leo Ognall, who writes under the pseudonyms Harry Carmichael and Hartley Howard, had first learned of Joan's case when Serene Gerson, the editor who discovered Joan's reading habits, told him that many of the books Joan had read in the months before she vanished were penned by him, including his novels Into Thin Air and The Screaming Rabbit, two books which had plots oddly similar to Joan's own disappearance. Ognall said in a 1964 article printed in the Boston Globe, quote, "At first I was chilled by the link between the mystery and my books. I spent night after night lying awake trying to tie the myriad of loose ends together. I decided the only way I could help was to write a fictitious thriller incorporating everything I knew about the case." Ognall went on to say that he believes Joan is living alone, incognito, somewhere between New York and Boston, and that she wants terribly to see her children, but is harboring a horrible secret, which he intends to reveal in his novel in the hopes that Joan might still be reading his books and would come into the light after she was exposed. Unfortunately, Joan Risch never returned home, and she has never been found. And again, we're talking nearly 60 years gone by. To this day, investigators do not know what happened to the young mother who disappeared from her home on October 24th, 1961. Many people believe that Joan died that long ago October afternoon, forcefully taken from her own home. Other theories have surfaced that she lies buried beneath Route 128. In a 1996 article in the Boston Globe, the former police chief in Lincoln and one of the only living investigators who worked Joan's case said, quote, "This is one of the things that I would most like to see happen before I pass on, to have some resolution to that. It's sort of a stone around my neck." Her husband, Martin, remained hopeful that his wife was still alive and somehow, someday she would return. He stayed in their home in Lincoln, Massachusetts for years after Joan vanished, not changing his phone number on the hopes that she may one day call. At some point, the house that Joan had been excited to raise her young family in was moved from its lot in Lincoln to another space in Lexington for another family to live in, likely unaware of the haunted remnants that Joan left behind on that long ago October day. Time erodes the possibility of ever knowing what happened to Joan Risch. However, as we've seen in recent years, there is always hope. Bodies are found, DNA is matched, and stories are finally told. In 2009, Joan's husband Martin passed away without ever answering the question, what happened to Joan? That concludes the primary story of Joan, and I will just talk a little bit about thoughts on the case, theories on the case. It is definitely a really bizarre story, and I think one of the challenges is if someone attacked Joan and took her away that day, it is a little bit odd that there were no eyewitnesses, no one heard screams. But again, those things happen. They've happened many times. And the police's original theory seems to me like the most logical theory, that someone was watching Joan. They attacked her that day, they abducted her, and in all likelihood, her life ended shortly thereafter. And perhaps someday her remains will be found, but it's also possible they never will be. In terms of the theories about an accident that led her stumbling around the house, leaving smears of blood, that doesn't explain the phone ripped out of the wall, and it doesn't explain why she has never reappeared. And the faking her own death scenario, that feels very far-fetched to me. And as someone who writes thrillers and mysteries and reads a lot of thrillers and mysteries, if I were to disappear, anyone looking at my browser history or my reading material might surmise that I had a hand in my own disappearance, when in reality, I would never leave my family, never leave my life. I just don't think that that is common for most people, unless there are some really dark things happening in the household. As a mother, I can't imagine ever leaving my child willingly. It would take a mad person knocking me unconscious and dragging me out of the house to make me ever leave my child home alone in my house. So the hard thing about considering cases like this is we all have our own biases and perceptions, and my auto reaction is no. She did not leave on her own. But again, that is a response and an opinion shaped by myself and how I feel like I would react. And there is also this part of me that feels like it's such a huge disservice to a human being who has potentially been stolen from this world in a very violent manner to then twist and distort their final days and essentially place the blame of their disappearance on them when maybe something much darker occurred, and now that perpetrator is never held accountable because people have decided she did this to herself because she liked to read mystery novels. And anyone who likes to read thrillers and mysteries, pretty much every one of them is going to have a disappearance. That's usually what lies at the heart of those books. So one thing I will also mention is I was talking about this case with a friend of mine a couple nights ago, and we were thinking about the idea of her disappearing on her own. And one thing to consider is this was 1961, and Joan was a stay-at-home mom with a husband who worked all the time. She was in a new area, she didn't have friends, and she was likely living a pretty lonely life. And in the rest of the world, there was a lot going on with the women's rights movement. The status of women in America during that period of time was really starting to change, and there was this whole counterculture of women who were essentially shirking the idea of being a stay-at-home wife and mother. And so I think when you consider that, it could potentially lead credence to why someone might abandon their life, because they are feeling really stifled in that role and they are witnessing in the world around them this alternative that people are pursuing. And in Joan's case, outside of her small nuclear family, she did not have a family that she was accountable to. So there were no parents. They had died in a fire. There were no parents that were going to say, you don't abandon your kids, you don't abandon your husband. It just makes it a little bit easier to disappear when you have a smaller network of people that you are in contact with. And 1961 was also just a different reality than what we have now. You could actually disappear at that period of time. We didn't have an internet trail and a paper trail like we do today. And there were a lot of people kind of moving fluidly around the country, and there were a lot of people who maybe didn't have histories or they were hiding their past. So again, is it possible? Sure, it's possible. Is it likely? I don't think it's likely. I think what makes the most sense to me, again, coming from the perspective of a wife and mom, is that something terrible happened to Joan on October 24th, 1961, that someone took her and ultimately took her life. So that wraps up today's case about 31-year-old Joan Risch. If you have any information regarding the disappearance of Joan Risch, you can contact the Lincoln Police Department at 781-259-8111. If you have any comments or suggestions for cases, you can email me at bitterendingspodcast@gmail.com or bitterendingspod@gmail.com. You can also find me on Facebook at Bitter Endings Podcast or on my website at bitterendingspod.com. I have also started to convert the podcast into YouTube videos. If you are interested in checking out the YouTube videos, which are essentially the audio from these podcasts, along with a slideshow of images that are from the cases themselves, combined with some stock images, you can find those videos by searching Bitter Endings Podcast on YouTube. Today's episode of the Bitter Endings Podcast is sponsored by my recently launched fiction novel, Helm House, and that's Helme House. Helm House is the second novel in the Troubled Spirits series, and these are paranormal murder mysteries that are inspired by true crimes. And Helm House was inspired in particular by the case of Joan Risch. If you are interested in grabbing a copy of Helm House in ebook or paperback, you can find the novel on Amazon.com, or you can visit my website, www.jrericksonauthor.com. For complete show notes on today's episode, as well as to find links to everything that I mentioned in the episode, you can visit my website, bitterendingspod.com. You can also find me on Facebook at Bitter Endings Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.